fantastic to have you and fantastic to interview you as opposed to the opposite way around. So this will be on YouTube, obviously with your permission. So it's very much an interview for people to listen at their own time as well. And we have an audience who will ask us questions as well. So Sean, are you ready to go?
Ready to go.
Perfect. Okay. So very much looking forward actually to interviewing you. Sean, we're the net zero zone. Let's just explain why we call it net zero zone. We do that because net zero isn't a point estimate. Nobody exactly knows where net zero is, albeit maybe 2 or 3 dozen companies claiming to be climate neutral. It is a zone. We clearly have to get much closer to net zero, but where exactly it is, given the state of offsetting, we don't actually really know that. And there is already criticism from some, such as Greta Thunberg, that where we really have to go is to a real zero. So essentially, do not permit any offsets and come to a real zero world. Of course, a real zero may be something that in some sectors, such as cement or agriculture, is practically impossible. What's your view as the opening question for the net zero zone? Are we aiming for net zero, or are we aiming for real zero? At this stage, let's focus on 2050 as a target year, and then we vary that later.
What we focus on is a world where we can stabilize climate and protect those of us who are most vulnerable from the transitions that we now consigned ourselves to experience in the 21st century. That's the game. Exactly how we get there, frankly, we do not know. What we do know is that going to zero wherever we can is the target. The closer we get to that, the tougher some of those choices and offsets will become. Sure. So I'm with you. I'm saying that net zero is a good way to describe this, but I'm also with Greta because I know that there's going to have to be a whole lot of tough decisions about what well, sequestration. We are going to have a massive rollout of direct air capture to have any chance of meeting our targets by 2050. I do not call that offsets. I just call that part of the mix of solutions. So where I differ a little bit is I do think that anything that gets us there counts. And I am not going to say cement can only exist if it's net zero at that particular plant. I want to drive cement and steel and other things to the lowest possible emissions. And I think they can be way, way lower than what they are now. Steel can actually be zero, I think. Cement's a bit different. But I also know that there will have to be compensatory activities. I don't necessarily agree with the formal offset schemes we have now and the way they're constructed, or even the ETS for that matter, because I think they're too slow. We need to move things much faster. Every single wedge has to move fast now. We can't just move one wedge fast and leave the other one to later, which underpinned our thinking in emission trading schemes 20 years ago. So yes.
Let's go to sectors specifically. I think very interesting. So cement, you say, can't get to real zero. Steel can. Agriculture?
Well, it may be. So, sorry, like I said, we do not know in many of these sectors. I can tell you, for example, that we can reduce emissions in the cement industry, the concrete industry, to be precise, by somewhere between 70 and 90%. And I think we can do that in 10 years. Now, that contributes 7% of global emissions. I don't think we're going to stop pouring cement, but there may be other things that appear. And the beauty of this, and the beauty of why the taxonomy, is that we can drive innovation in solutions. So in 2030, it's quite possible that we will, let's say with skyscraper-sized 3D printing plants, which is I think where we'll get to eventually, we'll be able to use these things with zero emissions or different kind of substitution as possible. But we don't know yet. So in the meantime, we have to also work the other front of really pushing for direct air capture, pushing for everything while driving cement as fast as we can. But the end game in cement, don't know.
But that's a very good start. So in essence, it's about the direction. We're miles away. So if it's net zero or real zero, it's like we're going from Scotland to London and we're discussing the exact pub that we're going to have drinks at.
Exactly right.
So it's a little bit hypothetical. when you're talking about skyscraper-sized 3D printing plants, I think that's a vision that is also appealing, just to follow up on that one. So you believe that on occasions we need a lot of innovation to change our lifestyle. Is that essentially what you're saying there?
Look, the truth is we have a lot of innovation now. We have solutions. You know, this is an extraordinary moment in history. We have the most connected species ever. News travels at light speed around the world now, and people collaborate in groups of 6, which could be 6 different countries. This is something that could not happen anywhere near like this when I grew up, before the internet happened, for example. So we have the most educated population in history, globally, in the number of people that have been through university, secondary education. Don't get me wrong, we've still got billions who need more of this, but the resource pool we have and the ideas and energy is extraordinary. We have the longest lived population ever in human history. That is, people like you and I, who are old farts, can still keep contributing to we're 70, 80 or 90, which couldn't have happened in the past. Just think about what this means. This means this unbelievable pool of human capital, highly developed human capital, that is now, if we're successful in getting momentum going, and it's all about momentum now, is going to be focused on solutions. It's innovating anyway. We just want to innovate on how we run the planet. And so, I mean, I don't think this is something that we need to call from the rooftops to do. As soon as we get a momentum that we need, you talked on our forum around earlier about reducing emissions 7% per annum, exactly. As soon as that starts happening, you will see the most unbelievable flowering of engineering, biochemical, biological solutions to the problems we face. I have no doubt about that whatsoever.
Coming to the innovation, and first for the audience, you can ask questions on the chat and you can ask it on LinkedIn to discuss it with everybody out there. When it comes to innovations, do you think that the carbon capture and storage industry is really innovating quickly enough? Or is that just a slow moving train at the moment?
So I'm going to say anything that looks like it's going to get us to where we get to needs to be on the table. So that might mean everything from green hydrogen, which looks impossible for cost now. I'm very optimistic about that as well, to direct air capture, to maybe 3D printing of skyscrapers. All of these things need to be on the table. The question is, which ones are going to work when? In carbon capture and sequestration, I've been really pleasantly surprised in the last year. I'm a skeptic, to be clear. In the last year, seeing some of the interesting technological innovation that's going on around the world in that particular area. You know, I was in Iceland giving a speech not that long ago, and I had a presentation from Reykjavik Energy, where they've been capturing the CO2 from their geothermal plants. I mean, already pretty green, by the way, but not perfect. They want to achieve they want to achieve the closest they can to zero carbon with sequestration. They're capturing it, putting it in water, injecting it 100 meters down into young basalt, aerated basalt. It turns to rock in 6 to 24 months. I've got a piece in my briefcase. It's so cool. So that the leakage factors just aren't there. The cost, 26 euros a ton. That is remarkably close to the current ETS price. In other words, it's financially viable. And I'm thinking, whoa, this changes my whole view of CCS. It's not the only one like that. There are actually a whole series of options like that. So we need them to work, because unless pretty well everything that's possible is working, we won't make it. We need all of these things to work, even the things I'm skeptical of, and I can go into some more that I'm skeptical in the fossil fuel industry. We've got to work, it's just got to be ambitious enough. And so in their case, they're using that to get geothermal down to low down, but it could be used for offsets from the chemical industry, or rather taking carbon out and burying it. The volume projections that it can do are huge. All of these things are on the table until such time as we figure out how to do everything in a way that maintains the balance on the planet, which is what our species has now got to figure out how to do. I've lost you, Andreas.
But are there enough geothermal plants? So even if that approach is scalable in Iceland, can you hear me? Are there enough geothermal plants.
Yeah, look, that's just one technology, but in their case, they did a very interesting mapping of all the basalt deposits that they know will work. And honestly, they're all over the planet. It's huge. Now, they're not in some places. You won't find them in Germany, but you will find them in the Mediterranean, around East Asia. There's great swathes of land where this could be done. They think they could be, I think, soaking up something like a third to a quarter to a third of all carbon each year in doing this. I'm not suggesting they will, by the way, because I think there's many more things, and I don't believe in get out of jail free cards like that. I don't want to let up on the pressure to shift our electricity and energy systems down to clean energy. We have to do that. I'm talking about using this primarily to ensure that we get the solutions that are the lowest carbon out quickly, and that we start sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. There is no way that we can afford to let the emissions in the atmosphere get up to 550 or 650 for more than a short amount of time. I mean, frankly, there are many reasons. You will recollect that there are about 415 parts per million now. There were 250 in the middle of the 19th century. The range for a stable atmosphere, that, as we understand it as humans, is somewhere between 200 and 350. So we're already way over, which is why we're going to have a lot of climate impacts. Now, it's heading very fast to 550. We've got to be able to get it down. Remember that if we get it 550, if we stopped emitting emissions straight away, it would take the Earth about 1,000 years, assuming humans let it alone, to be able to restabilize to more normal levels of carbon. We can't afford that because, well, one thing, we get stupider at high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. When at the moment, the current trajectory of emissions reductions, it looks like we could get to 800 to 1,000 ppm by 2100. At that level of emissions, it's a bit like being in a closed-door meeting room at the university for 3 hours without any air conditioning working. Your brain actually starts running differently. Humans become stupider. Now, we might be able to mutate over 1,000 years, but not in 100 years. So that reduces our chances of addressing this problem. I don't want to be our species in 2100, we're living in 1,000 ppm, because I think that guarantees the loss of the species. We've got to get it down sooner. So between now and 2050, while we're heading for net zero in every single sector, we have to also be building a whole pile of installations and reforesting as well, and changing our soil practices so we sequester, and get that level back down from the 550 to 1,000 that it's heading to, fast. Everything works, we will need CCS, I'm sorry.
I'm sure we have to do many more of these discussions before we are too stupid to do so. My next question for you is, from the CCS perspective, so my big personal challenge is the mobility, right? So you build a factory to capture the carbon next to a geothermal plant, you build another one next to a chemical plant. Then the chemical plant might stop working for other reasons, and then you have your CCS factory that's in the wrong place. Don't you think CCS will need to be mobile, stripped on cars, on trucks? We'll need to find a way to actually not be so geodetermined.
There's a lot of different options for how CCS can work. We've set in the taxonomy leakage factor limits and some specifications for how it works. And now let's see what the industry can deliver to those factors. I'm going to say they're tough criteria. It's not an easy way out, and it's an area where there's a lot of innovation. Is it financially viable? Well, most CCS isn't, as far as I can see, unless the ETS price hits 100 euros a tonne. I wish it would, but it looks like that's a long way off, unfortunately, in Europe. The Reykjavik Energy one was financially viable today. So I thought, okay, there's a slice that we can tackle. Bingo, apply that. I told them if they want to issue a green bond and go global, I'm in, I'll support them, because I can see that now being financially viable in a whole series of geographies that have the emissions and the sequestration potential next to each other. You're perfectly right. But that doesn't, this isn't a silver bullet. It's part of a puzzle. We need all the parts to work. There'll be other forms of CCS to work. In some places, it's not going to work. In which case, frankly, polluting industries will probably have to close down there. That is one of the changes we'll need. We need a globalized world. because we need to shift things around to optimize the carbon management of all of this. For example, it might be better to be building steel plants next to green energy plants in the desert in Morocco, rather than shipping the hydrogen to ThyssenKrupp in the Ruhr. That could be one of the things. I'm not sure, but we've got to start entertaining those things, as you say. And maybe that'll apply to CCS too, if it works. I don't believe CCS is a long-term instrument. I think it's a bridge. By 2050, I would rather we weren't building CCS and we've already stabilized things. But right now, things are so bad, are so extreme, we cannot preclude anything, and we need to try everything. 50% reduction in 10 years is what we have to achieve to even have a chance of avoiding utterly catastrophic climate change. We don't avoid volatility. We're going to get a lot of pandemics this century. They come out of climate change. We're going to get a lot of famines and floods and other kinds of disruptions, fires like in Australia at Christmas. This is the new 21st century norm. We can adapt to that while we try to right things. What we can't adapt to is if we start heading towards 550 and 1,000 ppm. That is a world that we're not sure we can live in at all. I don't believe there is necessarily, well, there is not a future for the species as we know it. There may be for a mutated version of the humankind. Now, Gaia could right itself, but for those radical greenies who think we just get rid of humans entirely, it's not actually certain about that, because of the extent to which we've seen changes in temperature in the sun over the last couple of 100 million years. We need to keep the stable environment we have now to be able to move forward. And that involves humans fixing their mistakes. That involves humans getting greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere to bring it down to a sensible level, not just abandoning the plot and letting it go for a few thousand years of high GHG. We're not sure life can survive that at the moment.
So let's come to the good side of things, the green taxonomy, working pretty well. What are the, and you have, I mean, you and me traveled to China, Beijing, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and other places. What were the three most remarkable things you experienced outside Europe regarding the green taxonomy?
There's a few things we've done in the taxonomy that are very confronting for countries around the world and people around the world. Not so much climate scientists. I don't think there's much we've done in the taxonomy that's a surprise to climate scientists, except they don't necessarily understand what we're trying to do with finance, but in terms of the thresholds. But let's take the gas one. You know, we've set a tough but necessary threshold of 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour for electricity generation and so on. What that basically says, unless you're using CCS, knowing that it's not financially viable, so not that likely at the moment, but maybe it will be, you can't use gas. Not to mention that, we've also said very, very clearly that gas is a big problem because of methane leakage. You will, if you follow this territory, you will have seen no end of scientific studies and reports over the last 2 years about this spike in methane in the atmosphere over the last 7 years, and the extent to which we now know that is coming from man-made systems, which is a real challenge for us. So for the gas industry all around the world, where it is being described as a transition strategy, Israel has announced it's shutting down its coal-fired power stations, but aren't we good under our climate change? We're building a whole lot of gas-fired power stations for the next 10 years because they've got gas deposits. Guys, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work because the level of fugitive emissions out of the system is utterly terrifying, and our ability to be able to manage those across the life cycle is bad, and we can't actually afford even 40 and 50% reductions on energy systems if we're going to achieve 50% cut in 10 years for new infrastructure. So we've got to leapfrog to clean energy, and that's been a challenging conversation everywhere from Japan to Colombia, I'm going to say. The second area that I would say that has been an interesting conversation has been the extent to which the criteria in the taxonomy, the thresholds, are science-based. That has not happened anywhere else yet. Now, of course, this is a crime in a sense, because we've been talking for 30 years with climate scientists about what's going to happen. And remember that at the moment, we're just traveling at the worst trajectory of the climate forecasts for 1990 and 1995. There's nothing surprising about what's happening on the planet. We have just failed, that's all, on every count to get emissions down. Even though you've got great individual stories, we have to look at the aggregate here. Now, the idea that we should be basing our decisions on what are the right things to invest in, what are the right policy, purely on the science, on the absolutism of the science versus relative measures, as you and I discussed earlier today. I know it sounds crazy, but it's a pretty fresh idea in policy circles everywhere. Most NDCs are deeply intermediated by what can be done given the political circumstances or the funding circumstances of the country. They're not expressions of the science. For example, and NDCs, I mean the climate change plans for each country under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. It's very rare to find a government institution that has goals that are purely science-based. We're getting them this year. It's beginning to happen. The European Union's 2050 net zero was an example of that. Of course, we still haven't signed off on the critical goal, which is the 2030 goal, the 50% reductions, because actually we'll kind of know what the world future is going to look like in 10 years. It's not going to take us 30 years. It's the next 10 years that count. So it's an evolving story, and that's been an interesting conversation. But I will say people are beginning to take it seriously. You know, there's a bill before the Japanese Parliament at the moment, the Diet, for 2050 net zero. It's not yet been supported by the Prime Minister, but it has been put into the Parliament by the Juno Coalition Party. That's significant. That's a change in the Japanese environment, and so on in different countries around the world. So I think they're the things I would say. There's lots of detail I can give you. Look, I've got to tell you one other one. My partner said to me last night, she works in legal help for poor people in the UK, for poverty law, let's call it. And she said, everyone's talking taxonomy nowadays. Why is everyone talking taxonomy? They want a taxonomy of things that we can do in the legal aid sector. And in science and in climate science around the world, everyone's talking taxonomy. If there's one thing we've done with the EU Technical Expert Group, is we've made this concept of taxonomy, the procurement list for Paris, and now washing over into other sectors like the legal and social sectors, the new term of the year. I'm sure there'll be a whole new definitional section in the Oxford English Dictionary next year.
Taxonomy, the word of the year. It's been extremely popular, and I was myself surprised that when we made the statement on the green recovery from COVID, that we get coverage from the New York Times to the Straits Times within a day. It was fantastic. Coming to the science-based, do you think that the leadership that virologists took now in the crisis and the lockdown, that will lead politicians to become a bit more science-based also on climate? Like we're flattening a COVID curve, don't we also have to flatten the climate curve?
I guess the litmus test, whether the president stopped talking about swallowing bleach to try and cure viruses, that's probably our litmus test. But to be fair, I do think it does change things. You know, one of the interesting things about this grand experiment in the health of our populations we're running now, which is every jurisdiction has its own approach to dealing with the COVID crisis, some really effectively and some unbelievably badly, like the country I'm sitting in. I'll leave you to guess where I am. Then we're getting a real live comparison study of who's doing what where, and you can tell very quickly who's listening to the scientists versus who isn't. And by scientists, I do mean virologists and epidemiologists. I don't mean behavioural scientists, which is what the UK listened to before they listened to the epidemiologists. So this is, I think, a potential turning point in our understanding of what we have to do in the face of a crisis. And there is, I have to say, hearteningly, a global discourse now about the need to ensure we learn from this crisis to deal with the other overarching crisis. And I think having the change of guard at the IMF, Christina has used her moment to really hammer this in a number of forums I've been a part of recently. But Christina at the IMF, Christina Lagarde has also been saying this at the ECB. So the change of guard at the top has been very timely. They're now reinforcing that message in a way we need it reinforced. And I think the message is, we're in a crisis here. In a crisis, you need to figure out who really knows about this, and you need to listen to them. It doesn't mean you're going to get it right, but that's a damn sight better than listening to the people with the alligator shoes who have currently been running climate policy in some of our countries for the last 20 years.
People with the alligator shoes. Sean, coming back on the conceptual level. So sorry?
I know you've got a pair of alligator shoes. That's okay. But this is an old-fashioned term for hucksters and salesmen. And the oil industry hucksters and salesmen have at least watered down climate policy drastically and dramatically to the detriment of the whole Earth over the last 30 years. So yes, I am hopeful that we'll see a change in that in most countries. And I already see that the prospect of a change of government in the US, there will be a stronger climate plan. Maybe it won't be as strong as you and I want. But remember, at the moment, what I'm most concerned about is momentum. We need to have the wave, the tidal wave going in one direction. And then we can work more on the stuff 10 years out. But really, momentum is what it's all about now. A shift in sentiment, a shift in a belief what the future is going to hold, and a shift in focus of all our activities. And I think I'm optimistic about that, I have to say.
That's excellent. Another conceptual question for the audience, and guys, you can post questions, as I said, on LinkedIn as well as on the chat. When we're looking at staying below 550 and also achieving net zero 2050, is it about debrowning? Is it about greening? Is it about both? How does that interplay? Because the public discourse is a lot about greening things. We don't much publicly talk about debrowning. You're implying that here and there in your comments on things that don't work anymore, but it's not there is no policy agenda that says debrown the economy. How do we frame this, and what is it about?
There are some challenges with debrowning. There's a challenge of investment opportunity here. Remember that we don't have any shortage of capital on the planet. We could retool the planet easily if we reallocated the current pools of capital. There's no shortage of capital. It's just in the wrong place. A lot of that capital is actually in safe instruments like German bunds, left over from 2008, which is why interest rates still remain so depressed in Japan and in Europe, even before the COVID crisis. So the first important thing, in my view, is not to get people to exit out of brown, as much as I think that's important. The most important thing is to create the places that can be invested in that are the green solutions. The real problem we have in the world today, in my view, is the lack of rapid action by the part of governments to create the regulatory, the planning, the policy frameworks to ensure that new kit gets built that is green. And that some of that is new kit, and by that I mean solar plants rather than fossil fuel plants. But a lot of that is repurposing kit we're building anyway. So Jakarta has now brought in a green building code. Every city in the world has to bring in strong green building codes. They need support with governance. That's going to soak up vast amounts of capital necessarily in creating buildings and other urban infrastructure that is fit for the next century, or rather the next 30 years at least. That is low carbon, very energy efficient, enough with the glass skyscrapers. Think about different architectural forms, and climate resilient as well. So this is something that we can do in that sector. Government needs to act on that. It is not happening voluntarily. Speak to anyone in the energy efficiency space in Europe, and they'll tear their hair out because they've been talking about how you can make money on this, but no one seems to be doing it. I happen to think there's a lot of reasons why people are doing it. We have to act on that. Other areas, in the cement industry, in the hydrogen industry, in the steel industry, there is work for government to do to engineer the change in framework that will lead those industries to change. It might be creating demand. Give you an example. If the European Commission went further with its energy efficiency targets and mandated that all public buildings, all buildings from a certain date, 2025, had to use concrete that are in line with the taxonomy and could not use any other concrete procurement plan, you would see the shift straight away. Why? Because I happen to know that all the majors have a line in concrete available that meets the taxonomy. They're just not selling it because it's small beer, niche product. They price it highly. It's not taking off. You drive demand in that sector. In every sector of the economy you're looking at, in agriculture, the carbon agricultural policy, the climate agricultural policy needs to become a carbon agricultural policy. It needs to be focused not on just reducing emissions and so on. It needs to be focused on sequestration, changing our soil practices to suck up carbon. That may mean abandoning some crops that are not very good for carbon, like maize, or at least genetically re-engineering them so we can use them. Okay, controversial issue, but we have to start looking at these things. How do we shift every aspect of the economy? Now, we don't shift quickly with private forces. We can in some areas, it's possible, but even in mobile phones, you know, people always say, but mobile phones, that was done by private sector. Actually, the most substantial initiative which led to the rapid growth of mobile phones was the adopting of common mobile phone standards in Europe. It was the standards initiative that fueled the rapid growth, that allowed technological innovation to come in at a larger market and larger volume productions. So government has to look in every different area about what its role is, which doesn't necessarily mean spending money. It's often regulatory, and above all, how we plan our land, our use of our land. And then private capital will dive in. We will ban some things. We have to ban some things. We banned the incandescent light bulb in Europe. We do need to simply ban coal-fired power stations. They've got to go. But we have to have a way to be able to put other stuff in quickly. So I'm saying, get the green train growing. It's exciting. It gives you a sense of optimism. It will create deal flow for investors going forward, and it'll tell all our listeners and our students where we've got to focus our energy. And then at the same time, get a crew behind you to go and shut down all that old crap and get it off the balance sheets. But do it in that order.
Okay, green train going first, and then there's another crew that takes it off the balance sheet, the brown stuff. So there was press coverage today saying in the COVID crisis, there's been huge reductions in emissions, or good reductions in emissions if you want to, since we're all staying home. But at the same time, that means that even if we are all staying home as individuals, we're still having so many structural emissions that we as individuals can't even affect. So to what degree do you think individuals can help by their behavior, and to what degree individuals help primarily by their voting and by their maybe pension fund engagement?
You know, when you're aware of a danger or a threat or something terrible, there is a moral imperative to try and act. And one should try and act, in my view, as a moral citizen. So one should look for ways to reducing emissions, to tread lightly on the earth. But don't kid yourself here. That's not going to change the planet. If you want to look at where emissions are, they're in electricity generation. A little bit of reduction would help. Shifting the system at a system level to being clean will really help. In transport, it's about switching our fleets over and shifting to things like electric rail instead of aviation, as France has insisted Air France, KLM do in the bailout, that they stop flying short-haul flights and people will fly per train. These are all things that we can do, but systemic approaches are going to be far more effective. One systemic approach on the east coast of the US. I have lots of friends who want to catch a train, but if you're catching a train from Boston to Washington, DC, it takes a lot of time, it's rickety, and sometimes it doesn't make it. They just need TGV. That's all they need, or better, the high-speed rail in China, which is a much better quality than TGV. You can put your phone on the side of the window on a train traveling from Shanghai to Beijing, and it doesn't wobble. It wobbles on the TGV. So let's get the Chinese into East USA. Okay, that might take a couple of years. So these systemic changes, which are about how we manage our society, are the critical issues. If you want to look at what we're going to do about seafoods, then not eating endangered fish is a moral decision. Work on it. But what have we really got to do? We have to turn 30% of our oceans into marine reserves now. Now, international waters as well as coastal waters. Now, how are we going to do that? Not by individual action. We're going to do that by voting. Now, that could be voting in many ways. In election, it could be voting in your pension fund. That is possible for some of us. It could be voting your capital if you're in a position to be able to exercise that kind of power, if you're running a pension fund. There are many ways that we can act systemically. But even if you're a pension fund, it's a bit like being an individual. I do not think the most important thing you can do is to change your stock picking algorithm. I do not. The most important thing you can do is to make it clear to governments, preferably with all your other pension fund and insurance funds colleagues, what the future needs to look like and that what you want from them and how you will invest if they create the green future we all need. Because it's going to be lower risk for you. You're less likely to have your portfolio decimated by 2050, which is what the Institute of Actuaries says is going to happen to your portfolio now if we don't take strong action on climate change. So band together, all of us, in whatever way we can, to work for systemic change. And maybe that works at University College Dublin as well, with students making sure that the investments of their peers at the university are going in the right direction, or there is no fossil fuel being used on the campus. Look for systemic solutions while adopting a moral position in your own right.
That makes good sense. Coming to your absolute pet topic, bonds. So we have the green train that we're pushing ahead, and some companies, such as Enel, claim they've got run out of the green train. They've already pushed it as far as they could, and now they're aiming to go into climate transition bonds. So under certain conditions, financing activities that are not exactly green. What's your view as climate transition bonds following on from green bonds for companies who have used any project they have for green bonds?
I'm happy if someone like Enel is doing things which are getting us to our target. That won't always be just building solar. There's plenty of things they can do in their portfolio. So there's sort of two responses. One response is, if you think you can't advance the low carbon agenda because of the energy system settings, and that is the case in Europe, because of the policy guidance, the incentives, and the lack of disincentives in different places, and that might be right, but you can't push it further, then we need to be looking at those policy settings. We don't say, oh, that's all we can do. Now we've got to go and build a gas plant. Hey, yeah. This is where we've got to work together. Now, on the other hand, if they're saying we want to invest in other kinds of things beyond solar, which are still consistent of achieving the Paris Agreement, I'm all with them. And that's what I consider transition. Stuff that in our past narrative, we haven't bought into that. Mining industry. Now, I'm not saying Enel is going to invest in mining, but we need a whole lot of minerals to make this transition. I'm going to tell you that investing in cobalt, especially if you're addressing the social provisions of the European taxonomy, i.e. we've got to find cobalt, we've got to better manage the cobalt that's being extracted out of the Congo so it's done properly, etc., which is required by the taxonomy. We need a lot of cobalt. That is a mineral for the transition. So I'm going to say you can call it green or you can call it a transition investment. Equally, we need to be investing in steel and aluminium. Now, aluminium in certain circumstances is dirty. If you build it next to a coal-fired power station in southern China, it is essentially emissions in a can. But if you build it next to a hydroelectric plant in Quebec, as Alcoa does, it is still electricity in a can, but it's clean electricity. So there's transition investments to be made there to be getting the aluminium industry to shift towards clean energy, or in the steel industry, shifting our capex so that we head towards, in 10 years' time, zero net carbon. There's a lot of transition things. I don't believe there's such a thing as transition that should be and can be and will be allowed that is not consistent of achieving the Paris Agreement, Because remember, we don't have any kind of future if we don't achieve the Paris Agreement. But there's a huge swathe of things which are going to take us 5, 10, 15 years to get to. Those transitions need to be understood, funded, and supported. And that's what transition bonds will be.
And how strong do you see their growth? Do you think they're going to grow 20, 50%?
Well, there are not really any transition bonds you can count at the moment, at least it's on one hand. So the market doesn't really exist yet. But I do think that in the next 5 years, transition bonds will become a vast part of the corporate market. I'm not expecting them to become a big part of the sovereign market. And remember that 55% of the $100 trillion bond market are sovereign bonds. Yeah. But I am expecting it, or government bonds, I am expecting a big part of the corporate market. In Japan, METI, the Ministry of Environment, Trade and Industry, has published a couple of pages of principles for transitions and transition bonds. And they are saying, consistent with the Paris Agreement, good on them. And I think that they will support the growth of a bond market like this, and also a transition loan market as well. By the way, in places like China, the green loan market is 10 times the size of the green bond market. And it's already the second largest green bond market in the world. So the loan market is also something that's happening in here. The key thing is that when we look at where the money's going, we just need to be able to understand it in the context of where we have to get to really fast.
Sean, the question then would be, if there is green bonds and there's climate transition bonds, is there any reason for a company to issue a plain vanilla normal bond?
Well, at the moment, we've identified sustainable investments. I don't use the word green all the time because it's more complicated than that. Mining doesn't really look green to most people, but it is part of the sustainable future. Climate resilience and adaptation investments, sometimes people think is different things. So let me use the word sustainable, which is what the EU taxonomy uses as one. We've in the process of identifying brown investments, clarifying that. As you know, Andreas, many people have done work on this, but it's also something that the TEG, the taxonomy group, has recommended to the Commission, as has the EU Parliament, and the member states and the Commission have agreed in December to do this year. So we'll get more detail on that in the future. But in the middle, there's a whole lot of stuff that you might call white, as in not identified one way or the other at this stage. So therefore, I don't think that everything will go green or sustainable until we get better understanding of what we're doing on white. But we will, because a lot of those areas have not been thought about enough in terms of mitigation role, such as agriculture, which is often seen as white, as in neutral, but in fact should be a green, as in taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or concrete. When I was saying earlier, we don't know where we're going to get to a concrete, I can tell you that there are some innovative firms offering concrete that are positive carbon after 2 years. That is, the chemistry of the concrete starts soaking carbon in. Now, these are specialty concretes. They're not likely to be used for a 50-story tower because of the different chemical composition. They can be used for many things, retaining walls or roads or whatever. So the question is, where's that innovation going to go to get us to somewhere? Now, these are all things that we're going to need to work on in the next 10 years, fleshing out this agenda going forward. And at that point, I've entirely lost your question, so I'm off track.
My question was, what are the reasons for plain white bonds? I have a question on climate transition bonds.
Let me pick you up on that. So there's a bunch of stuff in building that is white now that we're going to be able to make green. There's a bunch of stuff in every sector which we currently don't consider as pertinent that we need to pioneer and turn it into part of the green solution. In all the other sectors, we have to start thinking resilience and adaptation. There aren't many sectors of life that we don't need to start thinking about this. You know, in terms of our physical environment, our cities, we need to adapt those to what is going to be a century of extreme heat incidences. And they're not at the moment. If we don't adapt those in some places, we're going to see mass deaths, as in the millions of people, when we get to wet bulb temperature in somewhere like northern India, where the temperature with humidity gets to a stage where humans stop perspiring. If you're in a humid space, that's only 36 degrees Celsius, by the way. It doesn't have to be 60 degrees Celsius. It depends on the humidity. Now, at that point, you see we have about 3 or 4 hours to live in the open air, unless we can get into air conditioning. So what does that mean? Well, while we're working on mitigation to be able to get emissions down to try and minimize the extent of wet bulb incidents, which are going to kill potentially hundreds of millions, we have to also be building our cities with coolness, low carbon coolness, so we can escape. Outdoors in the Gulf will probably not be possible at all by 2050. So you'll have to go underground, and you have to build air-conditioned environments that are low energy because you're using the earth, the rock, to cool down air as part of the transition. So suddenly a whole swathe of other things start coming in. Creating cloth, which helps you survive heat. Some of it may be stuff with particulated water, which cools you down, or maybe just better evaporation. All these things, guys, that's part of resilience agenda. There's going to be textile resilient bonds out of this by the time we're finished. Everything should eventually be part of our understanding of what we've got to do.
So you're essentially saying the more problems we get, the more things will be green because they can contribute to solving the problems.
Correct.
That's an interesting way. So it's a self-reinforcing mechanism of what can be green in terms of the issuance. When we come to the sovereign, don't you think
as long as it's ambitious, as long as it meets what we require.
But when we come to sovereign bonds, Sean, don't you think for some investors it will be tempting, maybe not for the biggest nations on the planet, but for weaker nations, to have a sovereign climate transition bond so that the current government locks in the current state that the next government will have to follow, and regardless of the party?
Sure. Well, I mean, governments that are issuing green bonds are effectively doing that already. But, you know, playing domestic politics with bond issuance is a fraught game. You know, legislation can be changed by the incoming, or they can abrogate bonds. Goodness knows enough governments have done it, right? So I don't think that's the way to do it. Look at what Mexico did with its green bonds for the electric rail and the green buildings at the Mexico City airport. The new government decided they want the airport. They simply repaid the bonds and got out of it, and then they might issue new bonds in a different sector. This is not a particularly strong policing mechanism, Andreas, I'm afraid. A more substantial policing mechanism is to show that by issuing green bonds and other green investments, that they do get lower cost of capital, that they do help shift thinking in a society towards the opportunities and create other investment opportunities, and that both parties think it's a good idea, as is happening in countries where green bonds are being issued as a rule. So in Chile, in Netherlands, in France, in Fiji, there's no opposition saying green bonds are a bad idea. It is a common agenda as a result of this. And that's a more important part of creating the momentum, including the political momentum that we need to address these issues. Through these bonds, we educate the community, the finance sector, and everyone, and government officials about what needs to be done. Now, transitions, there will certainly be sovereigns that'll be linked to some kind of transition investments. If it meets the taxonomy, I'm in. If it doesn't meet the taxonomy, we have a problem. There will be a lot of governments who will issue resilience bonds and SDG bonds. At the moment, that's kind of uncharted territory in terms of robustness. Very vague rules when it comes to actual investments. One of the things that we will be working on in the next couple of years is tougher guidance about what is a resilience bond in the context of climate and the SDGs together. You need to understand the SDGs as indicators of climate, economic, social, and ecosystem resilience. But you still need to know what it means for an investment in a school, or an investment in a health facility, and there's work to be done there. And so we will see a lot more bonds from sovereigns. The key thing now is to, while taxonomy is such a popular word, to move to a global understanding of this, science-based global understanding. You can't have carve-outs because some government thinks that they can't do it or they don't want to. And I actually think that the global bond markets will enforce that aspect of it.
That sounds excellent. Sean, thank you very much for all the insights. I learned a lot, as usual. Very pleased to. We have 5 minutes left for questions, and I also would like to give you the opportunity to make whatever statement you think is most important for a scientific audience. Anything that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you.
Do you want to try questions first? I can't see any. I haven't got them in front of me.
It's late. We need to motivate the audience. I think you've been very good in. If you want to come forward. Yeah.
So we need to understand what we're doing here. Yes, we're on a project. We're on a historical mission to use the learnings of the last 150 years since the first climate scientist told us this was going to be a problem in the mid-19th century. It was a woman climate scientist, actually. I can't think of a name offhand, Andreas. And use that to now make decisions that are sensible for the sustainable future that we want to have. That's what this is actually about. You can look at this in a way as a fight about using rationalism in its best sense to craft history, rather than I'm going to call the knee-jerk reactions of some of the politicians we've been hearing in the US in the last 6 months on issues like climate, the last 6 years. It is actually a fight about how you think about the world and a fight about how you think about the role of the human species here. We have, over the last 10,000 years, discovered that humans impact the planet. I'm not going to say negatively or positively, I'm just saying it's clear. We've seen that in the tree ring records from the Bronze Era, of the changes as forests were burnt down to create bronze, in GHG levels in the atmosphere, and change in climate. We've seen this in many times in history. We now understand the 17th century as a period of global cooling, partly engineered by humans, taking smallpox and measles to the Americas and killing off 95% of all Indians that were there, and the forest regrowth were created. These are illuminations for us as a species. As we start to find means of communicating as a species, we have to start looking at means of acting positively as species. Frankly, we're juveniles trying to grow up. When I was a 16-year-old, I did some silly things without thinking about the broader ramifications. Now that I'm a little bit older, I like to think more about how I can work with others to right some of those errors I made, but to manage the planet better. The human species now has to grow up. This is our moment. We grow up, or frankly, I think we probably die as a species. We leave it to the cockroaches to have a second go later on. And this is what we're in the middle of now. Thinking about our role as stewards. It's not just stewards of capital. That's the tool we have available to us to help drive change, long-termism. It's stewards of our planet and stewards of all the species on the planet. That's what we're in the middle of doing. We need that agenda to be resolutely, deeply informed by the science in all its changing and learning glory, because that's the best thing we have at this stage. But it is a fight. We managed to win the fight 200 years ago that bridges should be built by engineers. It wasn't always the norm now, right? All sorts of people built bridges and they collapsed all the time as well. We just haven't done this on now the species-defying threat we face, which is how we manage our climate. We know what to do. There's an extraordinary amount of understanding about what to do. It's not 100% certain, ain't nothing is, but it is 80% there. We've got to build on that. And Andreas, what you and I and people in the finance sector have to do, or contributing to that agenda, is to make sure that capital can be the bulldozer that pushes governments, the community, science, corporations to actually do what our scientists know what has got to be done. That's what this is really about. Green bonds, They're just evidence. Money will flow in the right direction if you create the right kind of instruments. It's proof of concept.
We have a final question here from the audience, Sean, and that question is, why do climate scientists don't work more often together with politicians? It's probably a little bit related to some of the virologists. They get a lot of criticism in some countries, and felt that they shouldn't be that much exposed to, say, media criticisms for us. Do you think that we need to slightly make it more attractive for scientists to join this process? I also note that I'm the only scientist at the tech. Do you have any views on that?
Well, we did have 400 people involved in the taxonomy by the time we finished, with a lot of scientists. We righted that problem in the taxonomy work. I want to be clear, because of that particular issue. That's a more complicated issue. It is tough when we're in the middle of a fight, if you're not used to that. Politicians put themselves into the fight. Good politician will stand up for the science, as we have seen in many places around the world. If you're a scientist, I mean, some of the hate mail that Anthony Fauci is getting in the US at the moment, frankly generated by the offhand comments of the president that he serves, is unbelievably outrageous. Some of the misogynist threats that people have got in the science community, female scientists, way out of proportion of what the men get, apart from the odd attacks on the Michael Manns, are outrageous and very difficult to deal with. So it is no wonder that people who are very focused on a certain part of work think, hang on, I'm not so sure I want to get involved in that. I'll do my work and others have to take on it. So it is challenging, which is frankly challenging for everyone. But yes, I do think that we need to learn from some of the climate scientists, the Michael Manns of the world, that have put themselves forward into the spotlight to argue the case. We can't really afford, given the problem that's coming down the tunnel at us, to now just keep doing our work. We do need to seek to influence the decision makers that need to be influenced to make this change. But equally, and more importantly, there's a responsibility on us as ordinary citizens to understand this and to filter through the crap that pervades our media, that pervades our body politic, and to look through to I better understand what the science is saying. And those of you that have been through a university education are ahead of the rest of the population, because you've started learning the skills of how to filter and how to understand. It is also a responsibility, in my view, a moral responsibility of politicians to listen to the scientists. And I think we can hammer that home. Now, we're not going to win populist elections everywhere. We might lose to a Viktor Orban or a Trump or a Morrison in Australia, who don't seem to be wanting to listen to the science. But that doesn't mean we can't put pressure on other politicians to resolutely stand and fight it. I suspect the people who would lead us out of this will be more likely the politicians who have a populist touch, who can do what some of these do, but who also understand the science and know how to go into it. That's what we're looking for. They're the kind of leaders we want now. Where they'll come from science or liberal arts or whatever, that's an open question.
Perfect question to end on. Sean, thank you very much for an excellent interview. We've run out of time. I hope you enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed it and learned a lot. We will make this available on YouTube. You'll obviously have the ability to see it before that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sean. Speak soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.